Welcome to our web series Parental Alienation, a Silent Epidemic, where we are discussing with Indian and international legal and mental health experts about a form of child abuse which is very seldom spoken about and thus very poorly understood. However, research shows that parental alienation leads to outcomes at least as bad as children who are sexually abused. A pan-India survey of legal professionals and parents who've been through the Indian family court system reveals that 132,000 children, that is 132,000 children, are added to the alienated pool each year in India. And cumulatively, 1.5 million children are growing up alienated in India. The link to the survey findings are provided in the description below. But today, we have with us an extremely well-known name in the academic circles, an awarded scientist and teacher who's been at the forefront of research on parental alienation for the past decade. Her TED Talk on this has gone viral. She's published multiple papers in peer-reviewed journals touching upon various aspects of parental alienation, including about the extent of the problem, where her estimate that almost 2 million children are growing up alienated or are impacted by parental alienation in the United States alone has been an eye-opener. She's conducted multiple training workshops for legal and mental health professionals, has served as an expert witness and consultant in cases involving parental alienation and domestic violence, and has been a family therapist and a substance abuse counselor for a number of years. She received her doctorate in social psychology from University of Connecticut and is now an associate professor of psychology at Colorado State University. However, for me personally, her greatest achievement has been that she has successfully managed to dwarf the parental alienation deniers through her research and science. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer J. Harman. How are you doing, ma'am?
Hello, Dr. Kapur. How are you doing today? Sorry.
Thank you so much. Yeah, all well. So thank you so much for being part of this. And, we'll dive straight down. And, I usually start my discussions about children and focus on children. But today, I'm going to start with talking to you about the alienating parent. How I would like to ask you is, when for the viewers who are married or going through separation or divorce, what are the typical characteristics of a parent who's typically alienates? Is there a way that we can spot that this person is more likely to do alienation compared to the other parents? So has there been any research on this?
There has been. What my research is focused on is less about the personality of the parent, even though we do know that there are features of the parent that many alienators have. But my focus has been on, the behaviors and how it affects the other parent as well as the children. And parental alienating behaviors are the same as coercively controlling abuse. They are the same behaviors. The only reason that we call it something different, those of us who study parental alienation, is because we study how it affects the child to be turned into a weapon. So we know that coercive controlling abusers use children as weapons. That's been studied by domestic violence scholars for a very long time. They use the children to spy on the other parent, to manipulate the other parent so that they don't leave the relationship. That's been documented in many, many studies with men and women who are victims of the kind of violence that we call coercive controlling abuse. But it goes by other names like battery or intimate terrorism. There's a couple different terms that have been used to describe that type of violence. Right. And we don't find, despite what we see in the media oftentimes, when we look at actual national statistics, at least in the United States, I don't know about India, but in the United States, we don't find that there's gender differences in who's a victim of this type of abuse.
Right.
And the same thing for parental alienation. We don't find gender differences in the United States on who's a victim of parental alienation. Because it involves not just physical abuse. I mean, coercively controlling abuse is very psychological, and so mothers and fathers do it. And so when we talk about then, how do we know who does this?
Yes.
We look at who are abusive people, right? Who are the type of people who are betterers or coercively controlling abusers? And those are people oftentimes who have either some unresolved trauma from their own life, from their own history, like maybe they were weaponized as a child against a parent, or they witnessed it themselves, or were the target of that themselves, or they were abused in some other way that's led them to perceive everybody as a threat.
Yes.
Right? And then that's also then associated with some personality disorders, because that kind of trauma can make, for some serious psychological problems for that person. Okay. So we find so some scientists who study alienation have found like narcissism being common, or borderline personality disorder, or histrionic personality. And definitely in more severe cases, we see more antisocial personality disorders, where the person really doesn't care about the other person or even their child. They're only really motivated to control and dominate the other person. And so those are kind of the features. We don't find that alienating parents are really any that different from coercively controlling abusive parents when we compare the two scientific literatures. They're very similar.
True. So I think you really touched upon an extremely important thing where you stated that both men and women do this, depending on how I say it, is whoever has the power to do it. It doesn't matter the gender. The power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, kind of a paradigm. So, but I believe your research has found that men and women tend, among the 17 alienating behaviors that have been described by Dr. Amy Baker, you find that men and women use differently some of these alienate. So what are these differences between men and women, and how do they approach it?
Exactly. That's exactly right. When we look at aggression research generally and how men and women use aggression, they do tend to use it differently. And there's some evolutionary theories out there as to why that is. And there's also some social theories about why that is. But we find that generally women tend to use more indirect forms of aggression, and men tend to use, the research is kind of difficult to tease out. In the research on children, they find that boys use a lot more direct aggression, a lot more pushing, shoving, direct arguing, and threatening, whereas girls will, go behind the person's back, gossip. They'll try to destroy the reputation of the person that they're aggressing against. And then when boys and girls get older, we find that women still continue to use indirect aggression most, but that men will tend to kind of use both direct and indirect. So they'll have they're less confrontive and more, they'll use kind of both types of aggression. And that's across just the general aggression research. And we find the same with parental alienating behaviors. So moms, for example, Dr. Lopez has found this in her work. We found it in our research, looking at 2 different studies. And we found that moms tend to use strategies to alienate their children that make it harder to identify it was them. So they'll maybe talk to a teacher and have the teacher make a report to Child Protection Services. So then no one knows who was the original reporter, right? or they'll manipulate and kind of guilt the children into, rejecting the other parent. And there's really not a way to, know that they really did that. You can't go unless you were sitting in the room watching it. There's no way to know. Whereas they find that for fathers tend to be a lot more direct. So they'll use the same types of strategies like that, but they will also often tell children that they don't have to obey their mother. They will maybe create more conflict at parenting time exchanges, more direct fighting and pushing or yelling. So it's a lot more confrontive compared to what mothers sometimes, we found generally do.
Oh, okay. No, wonderful. So, so what you're saying is obviously the alienation done by fathers or boys, or the aggression by boys, is easily discoverable because it's far more in your face, while the one done by women, it sometimes is, for a lack of better word, a little more sneakily done and done on the behind quarters. But now moving on to, if I were to ask you that as a parent and who is now aware of that there is parental alienation, and I discover that, look, I'm planning to separate, and I discover some bizarre excuses coming from the child for not wanting to meet me, is there anything that I can do? And let's say we're at the early stages of the alienation, of separation. Is there anything I can do to prevent the spouse from continuing through this alienation behavior? Something like send her the literature or your articles and things like that. Does that help? Or appeasing an alienating parent, does that help?
Appeasing them doesn't help. Because what you have to understand is you're dealing with somebody who, if it is alienation, who they are motivated by power and control. And no matter how much power and control you give them, it's not enough. You can sign over all parental rights. You could say, fine, I don't really, I'll see them whenever you let me. And you think that would maybe give them what they want? No, it's still not enough. So and what it does is it just disempowers you. And when you have no power, then you have no way of, influencing what's happening. And sadly, the children in this kind of dynamic, when they become weaponized, when they're turned against you or used against you, luckily not all of them internalize that. Some children for some reason are able to kind of separate a little bit from it. Doesn't mean it's not stressful. It is, but some kids are somehow resilient. But when they do internalize beliefs that the parent never loved them, abandoned them, and is unsafe, then that change, when they start to do that, then the alienated parent really doesn't have a lot of control of changing those beliefs, right? Because if you try to correct it, then the child's going to say, you're just attacking mom or dad, or you're wrong, you're a liar, because they're defending the parent who's abusive. Correct. We see this with child abuse, sex abuse. Kids defend their abusers, right? And they often minimize the abuse. They don't recognize that they're being abused. You can't tell the child you're being alienated because they don't see it. So the important thing, and I know this is a dismal thing to say, but the important thing is to maintain as much control legally and as much visitation as you can, first of all. If you don't have any visitation or time with your children, you're at a disadvantage because you have no way to maintain your relationship and correct. Right. It's the lived experience that a child has with you. You're caretaking of them. You're attending to their emotions. You're having fun with them and being there. That is what maintains an attachment. And if you don't have that, the child, and alienated children don't allow themselves to really experience that. So you could be the best person and show up as the best parent in the world. And alienated children have been told to perceive you in such a bad way that they won't engage with you to maintain that attachment. And so, that's really when it becomes more severe. So you want to prevent it from getting that bad, because when it gets that bad, the child is so emotionally damaged. You have to do a lot more of an intervention like you would with other kinds of child abuse. Now you would have to step in and remove that child from the abusive home, or you have to do something to prevent exposure to the alienating behaviors, whatever that form that is. Otherwise, the child is constantly being subjected to it. And they don't see it. They don't recognize it. In fact, they often excuse the behaviors of the parent. They make up excuses for them. They're just telling me the truth. They're just trying to protect me. They're trying, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. Okay. They don't see any other way. And so you have to have intervention from an outside party to help with that. If it's earlier, the best thing you could do is, don't give up parenting time. Don't try to say, well, okay, I'll give you primary custody. I'll just take every other weekend. Maybe that'll make them happy and they'll stop. No, that won't ever make alienating parents happy. Because whenever the kid says they miss you and they want to see you, that's a threat. And they're going to start finding ways to influence the child to not see you on the weekend. And so that's the most important thing. Next most important is, just you got to know that you can't push a river, right? You can't make this child believe something else than what this other narrative is. So the best way to handle that is, if a kid says, Mom said this or something, you would say, well, that's your mom's opinion. I have a different one, but you're a child. I'm not going to tell you that. You be the healthy parent, and it's hard. I mean, I know parents who have severely alienated children who still come to visits because they don't want the mom to go to jail or the dad to go to jail. So they go to the visits, but they're awful when they're there. Like just mean and, destructive. And it's so hard as a parent to live with that because you have no power. The kids are totally empowered to rebel against you and not respect your authority.
Right.
But the only thing you can do is, get as much help as you can, get as much support as you can. Get a counselor to say, look, how do I handle when my kid says this without making it worse? You got to get support to do that. And, so I think that's my advice on that is just, you have to model good parenting, because when it can finally be remedied, you've been that good parent. You've had good boundaries. You don't tell children things that they shouldn't know. Yes. I don't care how much you want to tell them your side of the story. Don't do it. That's not they need to maintain innocence as the child. And your boundary with them as a parent is very important to protect their development. They need to develop their own identity and not get pulled into the drama of the parent.
Let me just interrupt you and ask you this. You said a very important thing. Don't tell them your side of the story, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I know it sounds very counterintuitive because you want to tell them, okay, your mom said this or your dad said this, but my side of the story is this. Now, if we don't, the most parents believe that if we don't tell them our side of the story, they'll grow up believing the only side that they know. So isn't that something, how do we juggle between these two issues in our heads if we are an alienated parent?
Well, you have to step back and say, okay, I know my child is being manipulated. First, understand that.
Right.
And if you start to then do the same thing that the other parent is doing, think about why you're wanting to do that. Is it because you're wanting to redeem yourself or prove something different than what the other parent is saying? the child isn't going to understand that. They're not an adult. They don't have perspective taking like an adult. They're not capable emotionally. They don't have the mental ability. Their brains haven't finished developing. Their children, especially like, young adolescents and even, teenagers, they think they know a lot, but they really don't, but they think they do. And the important thing is to hold firm, and you can acknowledge and say, you don't have to say, yeah, she's right or he's right, but just say, I hear what you're saying. It's unfortunate you were told that, or it's unfortunate that you've been, given that information. But there's a lot more to the story, and you're my child, and it's not okay for you to know this. Maybe when you're older, there'll be a time where we can. But what that does is it doesn't blame the other person, but it labels the behavior that happened to them as not appropriate. And it draws a boundary, right? A healthy boundary. And the kids won't like it, because kids they like to feel empowered. They probably feel great that mom or dad is telling them all this stuff, because it makes them feel like an adult, right? But that's not healthy, because they're not adults, right? And especially when it's not an accurate depiction of you. And I know the temptation to want to correct it. I've lived it. My husband's lived it. It's so hard. But now in our situation, the two older ones are in college now, and one is finally starting to deal with some of this in counseling. Okay. And she wants my husband to go to counseling with her. This is my stepdaughter. And he's looking forward to that, because now she's 19 and they can actually have a conversation if it comes up, because now he can correct it. Now she's outside of the influence of the parent. She's motivated to hear his side of the story now. Yeah. And doing it in a therapeutic way is actually the best way. But a lot of alienated children, even when they come to realize what happened to them, they often don't want to talk about it. It's too painful. And so you don't want to push it. I've seen a lot of parents say, well, we should talk about it. We need to heal. And, you got to let the child come to that when they're ready,
True. No, so I think what you beautifully said, one of the judges, which typical judges in India, what they do is, so they look at this issue and they say, typically the mother or the father says, oh, the child is not doing this. What about, because he's not paying maintenance. He's not paying me the alimony that I'm supposed to get. So what the judges end up doing is saying, okay, Mr. So-and-so, ensure that you pay this, and this thing will just all vanish away. But you beautifully said appeasement just does not work. But moving on to something that is something that's very important for us to really deep dive into would be around, let's divide the cases the way now it's typically done into mild, moderate, and severe, and look at how should the courts solve this problem. And let's look at all three differently and separately. So how should a court solve a problem of a mild parental alienation, which, just for the sake of the viewers, let me repeat, is when the child talks against one parent but goes to the house of the other parent or the alienated parents and has a great time, enjoys, and goes is probably just during the exchanges the child has a problem. That would be mild, right? So what should the courts do? Should the courts intervene here, and what should the courts do?
So parental alienation is child abuse, and so we treat it like best practices are to treat it like child abuse. And when you have a mild child abuse, where maybe there's a finding of psychological abuse or neglect of a parent, we know that best practices for that are kind of intervention, supervision of the family to make sure that the child is protected from it, and education for the parents, coaching to help them stop, identify maybe when it's happening and why. And maybe some family therapy for with alienation in divorced parents. Family therapy, we're not talking about both parents being in the room because they're not getting along. What we're talking about is a family therapist who would work with maybe dad and the child, and then in another session maybe just the child, and then in another session maybe mom and the child, but not mom and dad together, right?
Right.
Because there's with a parental alienation, it's like putting like a bully into a room with it's their victim.
Mhm.
You don't do that, like, because what the bully is doing, or what the coercively controlling person does, is tries to take advantage of that situation and use it against you. So a family therapist who recognizes that there is one person who's very controlling and is manipulating the child,
Mhm.
they wouldn't put those parents together, right, per se.
Right.
But that would be, psychoeducation, making sure that both parents are getting quality time with each other, and then addressing that. And if the parent doesn't stop, then you have to kind of take more, action to protect the child, right?
Which is moving on next to the step of moderate. So now that we've reached a stage where the child is very, very unwilling to go to the parent, has a significant problem for the first half an hour, 45 minutes, and then kind of warms in, but is really actually, like, I think Dr. Burnett beautifully said, the RRD, or the reject resist dynamic, where there is more of resistance rather than rejection, is how I would like to define it. So what should be done in such moderate cases? How should the courts handle it? What is the importance of the courts?
Well, here's where it's kind of a warning. When it hits that point, it could easily snowball and get worse fast, right? And so usually when these cases come to court, I know a lot of the clinicians I work with say that they put the court on alert that this family needs a lot more intensive observation and intervention. And so, psychoeducation at this point, maybe it won't work because it didn't work before. The parent usually, when it gets to moderate, usually the alienating parent isn't really recognizing their role in the problem. They're not seeing it, and they might need some treatment. So best practices are that parent, because they're the abusive parent, needs more intensive intervention for them to stop. So this is just like with child abuse. If you have an abuser who's not stopping, you have to have maybe more intensive psychological evaluation and treatment that's tailored to that parent's problems and their history. You have to usually what alienating parents do in moderate stages is there's a lot of gatekeeping behaviors, because they're trying to prevent the child from going to the other parent. And it might mean increasing the other parent's time. And so sometimes courts will put the alienating parent on warning to say, if this child continues to resist, and this is assuming there's no abuse, there's no safety concerns, that this is an alienation case, not an estrangement case, that they threaten them and say, if this continues, you're going to start losing time. You need to stop. The child needs to have time with this other parent. And if they don't, then the court has to follow through with that. And then there would be family therapy for the alienated parent and the child. Individual therapy for the child is usually, we know, doesn't work. It's like the opposite, because it doesn't fix the problem. Because the problem is the abusive parent's behaviors.
Okay.
And so if you're only treating the child, and that therapist is often then validating the child's feelings, and those feelings are not genuine, it's going to make it worse. And then the child's memories become distorted. They learn not to trust their own experiences with the alienated parent, and then it becomes more and more challenging to fix.
Correct. And so now that the case has moved on to severe, where the child just refuses to go or just completely refuses to talk, right? And that's, let's say, the first time the case has come to that particular court. So what should be done? What should the courts do? What should be the holistic view that the court should take and who are the players. Because, and in this, if I may just add one more thing. My experience has been, at least in India, that most of the psychologists, family therapists also have a very poor understanding of this dynamic, and therefore they tend to align with the so-called voice of the child. Now, is that same in the US, and how do we overcome that?
Yes, it's the same here. And a lot of it is their training. They're trained to validate feelings and trust that children's experiences are all true. Even though children often exaggerate and lie to get what they want, even when they're not alienated, they often do. But there's kind of been a real push in the U.S. that kids should always be believed when they say that they've been abused, for example, or mothers should always be believed. Which that's for another topic when we can discuss that. Because that would take me too long to go into that. But yeah, therapists, one of the strategies that alienators use is to manipulate third parties and other people to help them. It gives them more power, right? They're motivated to control and, get power. And they do that by forming coalitions. And so if the alienating parent has decision making about who to select as a therapist, they're going to hunt around until they find somebody who's sympathetic to them. Right. They could find somebody right away, somebody who doesn't do their due diligence and go and talk to the other parent who, has a biased opinion before even meeting them, who right. doesn't recognize that when a child comes and says how much they hate that parent, they don't understand that if the child really was abused by them, they wouldn't say those things.
Right.
They usually will cover up for them, or they will minimize the abuse, or they'll be honest sometimes about what that parent did if you ask them, but they still love them. There's still an ambivalence about them for kids who've been abused. So if they see a kid saying, I hate this parent, I feel unsafe with them, they're unfit, they're horrible. I know a lot of therapists who work in this field. The minute that a kid comes into their office and says that, they stop therapy right away. And they say, you have to go to court to get protection for this child because I can't treat this child without making it worse. And the alienating parent will sometimes then just go and find somebody else, right? They'll fire them until, and I've consulted with a lot of family therapists or individual therapists who recognize it's happened and they're nervous about talking to the alienating parent about it because they know that they're going to be fired and they're worried about the child. Right. So I encourage them to try to talk to the other parent, the alienated parent, and try to see what legal things are happening. And then, usually. So
what I'm hearing from you is, number one, that the court needs to do is also protect the so-called, what in US would be called as the guardian ad litem, because the guardian ad litem would be, or the GAL would be the first point of attack by the alienating parent, and allegations will come in. So the courts must hold firm and not allow the allegations of so-called bias to function. What is the other thing in severe or moderate to severe such cases that the courts must do?
So when it's severe, the child is so psychologically split and damaged that the only way to protect them, because the other parent won't stop, is to remove them from their custody temporarily. It's kind of like, you would do the same thing with a child who's been severely physically abused. Right. We have no qualms taking them away from the abusive parent until that parent gets help and stops. Right. And so we take them away until that parent gets the help they need to stop doing it. Mm-hmm. And then the child is reunified with the alienated parent. And although some people say, oh, it's so horrible, you can't do that, you're gonna destroy their attachment to their mother or father, whoever the alienator was. Well, we don't think about that when it's severe physical abuse. We don't think about that when it's sexual abuse or severe neglect and maltreatment, because we know that they're in danger with them. It's not a healthy attachment. And the attachment that you can still, we know that when people have been abused and the other parent gets help, it's still possible to repair that. It's not going to destroy the child. What destroys the child is to remain in an abusive environment. And so so when it's really bad, unfortunately, when you go to court, if it's your first time going to court and the court is made aware of this, you have to, sadly, and I'm not an attorney, but you have to kind of really demonstrate to the court everything that's been attempted up until then. You don't want to immediately just take the child away without demonstrating that other things haven't worked. Right? This is something Dr. Richard Warshak has written about. It's it's a last resort. Despite sometimes there's critics of alienation who say this is all alienation people do is rip kids away from their loving parent. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an abusive parent who's been not complying with anything. No court orders. They won't abide by them. They continue to just try to hurt the other parent. They won't stop. They don't see that they're responsible for what's happening. They think they're totally justified in what they're doing. Only then do you finally have to step in and say, no, it's so important for this child to have a relationship with their other parent, and you're not allowing it. And so we need to do something about it. And so that's where it's tricky, because if you don't get intervention earlier, it's a bigger burden to have to show, I think, when you go to court, because you're going to have to really demonstrate the whole history of the case. You have to show, because it is coercively controlling abuse, you have to show how it's happened over time. And you have to show that it's happening from one parent, and that you, as the alienated parent, nobody's perfect. You might react badly sometimes, but that you're just reacting. You're not just as responsible, because then you're like a loyalty conflict, and then you're going to be treated like a loyalty conflict, and then you won't get the treatment you need. You won't get the help you need. So if you are reacting to it because it's normal to react to it, you got to get some help and not react to it. Otherwise, that's going to be used against you in court.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. So, I had Dr. Alan Blotke with me on a week or two back. And he said something which really reverberated, where he said, the first and the foremost thing is that the alienating behaviors must stop for any therapy to happen, number one. And number two, the alienating behaviors is what is abuse. Therefore, that is what must be stopped before anything else. But, in that line itself, my question to you would be, see, in severe alienation, we are clear that we're going to have a therapeutic isolation or a temporary removal of custody. And therefore, we are sure that the alienating behaviors have stopped. But in mild to moderate, how do we monitor or get to know whether the alienating behaviors are stopped? Because, at the end of the day, it is once a week or twice a month kind of interaction. So how can we ensure stoppage of alienating behaviors in mild to moderate cases?
So in that case, because, if it comes on the radar of the court that this is an alienation case, and you treat it like child abuse, usually if it was like a child abuse case and that's referred to like a child protection services type thing, they would have a caseworker who would monitor that, right? Who would check in on the family. In cases where there's not that, right, you would have like maybe a guardian ad litem who's monitoring this. A family, the therapist that's assigned to work with the children and the parents would be monitoring this. And then, children, if, at some point they might say what mom or dad is trying to tell them, especially when confronted about, well, why don't you want to go to dad's house this weekend? And so they would be monitoring these types of things because, in that case, and then you can see, like, is the child kind of defending what the mom or dad is doing? Or they, and so somebody who's trained in this, who's been assigned to work with the family, can monitor that. And if the
Right.
progress, so then and then usually what we find is working really well in some areas is kind of a team approach, especially when it gets more moderate to severe, where you have a person appointed by the court who sort of manages the family, like a guardian ad litem, or it could be a psychologist who has training in alienation and understands it, but doesn't provide treatment, just
Right.
serves as sort of a reporter to the court on progress and who can make recommendations to the court. So they have to
Okay.
have the licensure and other things to be able to do that. And then, you would have a family therapist working with the alienated parent and the child. If it's severe alienation, you would have an individual therapist working with the alienating parent. And then they would have to be in communication with this team lead. So the team
Wow.
lead helps prevent the kind of influence that the alienating parent might have. Like, so if they're trying to manipulate their therapist, they can step in and say, no, that's not what's happening here. And kind of correct some of the things. And then they report to the court, like every 30 days, they submit a report to the court saying, is this working? Is it not? What do we have to do? Mom or dad is not complying with treatment. You
Jennifer,
know,
if I may, sorry interrupt you. This entire process in a resource constrained country like India
mhm.
is beyond the means of, I would say, 98% of the population,
Yep.
right? It's not how developed our justice delivery system is.
Right.
So therefore, I'm just trying to wonder, which is to say that isn't it, or correct me if I'm wrong, please feel free, that the moment it reaches a certain moderate level, till the time this entire team or something is possible or done, that the child first needs to be protected. That
Mhm.
means either there has to be a shift of custody with a kind of, maybe a 20-80-20 rule where the alienating parent gets to see the child, but for a very short while. So I'm trying to say, is there an answer for something like this?
Mhm. Yeah, we run into that. I mean, there's some states and regions in the US that are very impoverished and parents don't have the money or resources to do the kind of treatment. Sadly, if there is child abuse, we have state systems that are there, but our child abuse system in the United States doesn't really often recognize parental alienation, and they rarely intervene when there's psychological abuse in
Right.
general. They don't do it. And so, but that would be something that would fall under their purview and not be something that parents would have to pay for. But
Right.
unfortunately, that's not the case. So, yes. So, what are the solutions if there's no money to afford these types of things? Now, in severe, you're right. Protecting the child from the abuse is the most important thing. And if all it takes is just a protection order or something like that, then that
So
is, something that could be done cheap, not cheaply, but at least, um, but then I guess you'd have to think about it in each culture, like in each region and system, how is child abuse handled and treated? Sometimes maybe there's communities where there's supportive services that are, community support that is not expensive, or that there's churches or other types of, support there. But yeah, I mean, protection from that. I mean, we do know from the research that in severe cases of alienation, that just getting them away from the alienating parents' behaviors is the most effective thing. I mean, so even if you don't do anything else, that is the most effective thing so far. Now, again, that's mostly when it gets really moderate and severe. I mean, obviously, kids who are in mild stages should get protections too, but unfortunately, I mean, maybe in the mild cases, some kids can somehow still be resilient to it, if you can't find another way to intervene. But quality time with the other parent is probably the most important thing at that point.
So when you say, one, before I come to my last question, would be before that, we keep using this word that this is child abuse, right? I completely agree with you. But how about let's look at the research and say, why do we call it child abuse? What is it that really impacts the child? I know that a lot of time my friends and judges and even my friends who are psychologists and psychiatrists say, "Oh, the child seems to be doing okay in studies. The child seems to be having a few friends, right? I think let's just let things be." But what is the long term impact and why is it that's so important to look at?
Mhm. Well, even for people who study child abuse, there is disagreement about at what point does a behavior become abusive, right? There's no agreement on the level or frequency or severity at which you
Is
have
one
to.
slap an abuse or is it
Yeah,
not?
yeah, exactly. And so there's not even agreement within that field. I know even within the parental alienation field, I've had discussions with some colleagues who say that they think alienation is definitely just more child maltreatment. But when it gets more severe in their mind, then it becomes child abuse. But if you think about how we define child abuse, it's not just, psychological manipulation and whatnot. It's, there's neglect features to it because the child's needs are being neglected. And that can happen even in mild stages, right, where the children are being neglected. And so when it rises from maltreatment to abuse, we don't really know. I think there is some consensus among professionals in this area that it's usually maybe more at the moderate stage when it becomes more child abuse, which would then warrant more of an intervention from the court, right, to protect the child. Now, I forgot. I forgot what I was going to say about that. For child abuse. So what happens is when you have a child who's being alienated. I published a paper about this summer with Dr. Amy Baker and Mandy Mathewson, where when alienating parents' behaviors are designed to make a child believe that this parent that they loved, never loved them, abandoned them, and is unsafe. And that leads to what we call a corruption of reality. So the child's being taught something, they're being brainwashed or gaslighted or manipulated, whatever word you want to use, to believe something that is different than their lived experience.
Right.
And then that creates, so they have these distortions in how they view the world, and they feel disconnected, like we know from adults who were alienated as children. They feel very disconnected from their own feelings and their own thoughts because they don't trust them.
Right.
And that is abusive in and of itself. And then the long-term effects of just that are substantial because it changes how that child views everything, and that their experience is through this lens, this distorted lens of not trusting their own memories and feelings and thoughts.
Right.
And that trickles into every arena of their life. And then we can just go, and then that child then experiences so many losses because of that. And that's what our paper really focuses on, is they lose a connection to the self.
Okay.
They lose a connection. They lose their innocence because they're treated like adults when they're not. The parent-child relationship between the alienator and the child, that's kind of an innocent relationship where you expect this parent to protect you. But when these children get older, they realize that parent was abusive. So the innocence of that relationship is lost.
Yes.
And then they lose the relationship with the alienated parent, which is in and of itself a tremendous loss, because they lose a parental figure and they're never allowed to grieve it.
Right.
And the damage that does is substantial. To never grieve a pet or a sibling, we know that there's research on that really has long-term effects on people, that when they avoid dealing with loss.
Right.
And these children can't experience that, and then they lose their extended family, they lose their communities oftentimes. So there's so many things that happen. And so that's why it is, in my opinion, it can be very severe child abuse.
No, I completely agree. And I don't know, one organization which I am not so particularly fond of, and I believe you may not be too, is APSAC, right? The
Mhm.
American Professional Society for Abuse of Children. And I went through their literature on psychological abuse, and when they talk about spawning, they talk about corruption of reality, they talk about emotional, they literally list down exactly what is parental alienation. I mean, they've done a better job than you and me in defining how it is abuse, is how
Yep.
I look at it. And but I think they still need to come to terms.
Yep.
But lastly, before we go, is United States has been relatively more successful in raising awareness about parental alienation. Specifically, the courts have begun to act. They've begun to do things. There are programs like the Family Bridges by Dr. Warshak and Dr. Randy Rand. There
Mhm.
is Family Reflections, which
Mhm.
is there. Then Linda Gottlieb has her Turning Point. You've studied all these programs.
Yep.
What do you think is the one or two or three? What are the common principles which they literally subscribe to?
Mhm. So the programs you're describing have all been designed for severe alienation. So this is an intervention that's used to essentially kickstart the reunification process.
Right.
And it's not absolutely necessary to do these programs in order to address severe alienation.
Okay.
But it's a useful kind of supportive type of program to transition the child
Yes.
into the relationship with the alienated parent and protecting them from the other parent. What the programs all have in common is they're about 4 days long. They're
Mhm.
weekend kind of retreats. So it's not in a therapeutic setting, which probably for a lot of families they've tried and failed. And they don't want to associate the therapy office with, with what they're doing.
Right.
So it's meant to be kind of more fun, and there's activities, there's psychoeducation, there's family therapy involved. It's meant to really kind of start over and rebuild the relationship with the child and the alienated parent without the interference of the other parent. But these programs, they all have elements where they can only be done if there's a court order. So the court has to have determined that the alienated parent is safe. So they're
Yes.
not, the child's not estranged, that there's actually been, a child will be safe going to them. In family bridges, it's a more intensive, like, so if there's concerns about safety and the children hurting themselves or running away, they do usually a transfer at the courthouse with people there to kind of help with that. Turning Points for Families doesn't do that. That one is more where the parents just travel themselves with the children. And she's never had a family where the kids ran away, or that, or there was one family where there were twins who did that. But they didn't run away, but when they got there, they snuck a phone in and they broke the rules, and the alienating parent undermined the intervention. But that was only one out of, I forgot how many, 60, 70 families she's done that with.
Right.
But yeah, so they all have these elements where it has to have a court-supported intervention, and then you move into aftercare. And the aftercare is a lot like what I described earlier, where you have a family therapist working with the alienated parent and the child, and you have an individual therapist working with the alienator. And then they work together as a team. You maybe have somebody coordinating that, and then if they've determined that the alienating parent will stop what they're doing and that they apologize to the children and recognize and take responsibility for what they've done and tell them that they're going to encourage a relationship with the other parent again, then they can start moving to having visits again and having parenting time. So that's what they're all designed to do. They're just designed to kind of kickstart the process, and but they're not absolutely required. You can still set up a therapeutic type of intervention that resembles the aftercare for those programs,
Right.
because those interventions can be expensive to do, because you have to travel, or or there's a lot of costs associated with the mental health providers who are involved, because it's an intensive time. It's 4 days, and then there's aftercare. You have to still follow the family afterwards to make sure that they're transitioning. So it's not inexpensive. But that's the model. I mean, and it should resemble, probably, it should, resonate with some people. That's something you would kind of maybe do in a very severe child abuse situation. If you want an intensive therapeutic intervention, that's why it's so effective, is because it's treating the actual problem.
True. So before we let you go, just a quick last question would be to say, what would your advice be? Why hasn't parental alienation been already recognized? It's already 30, 35 years. India, in terms of parental alienation, is so-called still in the dark ages. We've had, fortunately, about 3 or 4 judgments where parental alienation has been recognized and action taken, but still baby steps. What do you think are the things that the alienated or the targeted parents can do to get a far more better understanding and better, let's say, response from the justice system on this?
Oh, that's a big question. That's something I struggle with every day. I think we're dealing with the critics of alienation. I think are people who don't really understand what it is. Yeah. Or the what I'm finding, sadly, is the people who are the most against it or kind of spreading misinformation about it are either advocates for children and mothers, mostly mothers, who believe that they've been abused but weren't, who are claiming to have been abused in order to alienate their children. And they're saying that they're engaging in these behaviors just to protect the child, which, you can protect a child from abuse without alienating them. First of all, you don't need to do that. And second of all, I'm myself am a victim of domestic violence, and it's very upsetting to me when I see people claim that they've been abused as a strategy to hurt other people, because it makes protections for people who have been abused. Right. It makes it where you're not believed, and you're not, or the protections that would be in place for people who truly are abused are not there. And it also fails to recognize how many men are victims of abuse, or men and women who are in same-sex relationships, which in the U.S., I mean, that's a lot. There's a lot of millions of people who are in same-sex relations. They're not even recognized. And we know that domestic violence is a real problem in a lot of those relationships. And so there's so much focus on just women being victims. And I'm not saying that it's not a problem. It is, but it's overlooking the fact that people can sometimes lie and manipulate the system to get control, right? And for women, it's easy to say I've been abused because people will believe it right away. And so it's an easy fallback. And so some of the biggest critics of parental alienation are that, oh my gosh, these are just things that abusive fathers say to get out of abuse claims. And my research does not support that at all. I mean, a lot of parental alienation cases, in fact, more than half, don't have any claim of other type of abuse at all. There's no conflict or allegations of abuse being made, because what that means is the alienating parent is using other means to alienate. And so the critics, I think, are often, they're advocates for parents, and they don't really understand that what we're studying is the same thing. We're studying domestic violence. We're studying moms and dads who are manipulating children against another parent, and we should be concerned about that regardless of gender, because the kids are what's important, and we only call it parental alienation because we study what it means for that child to be a weapon. Yes. It makes that child, it changes that child's attitudes, it changes their behaviors, it changes their beliefs. But what we're ultimately all talking about are abusive parents who are doing that. And I think if sadly, if some of the people who are so resistant to this would recognize that we're on the same team here, that, they would, and we need to stop people from lying about abuse and lying about alienation, Or there's a lot of people who don't understand what alienation is, and they're just using the term and they don't understand the dynamic. So if we can hopefully try to maybe educate and get people to see that, maybe we wouldn't see so much resistance everywhere. I don't know, but that's my dream. But I think that there's money. I don't know. I think there's money involved with keeping moms victims and dads perpetrators, sadly. So I don't think that, I think that if we want to get political, I think that's probably what's underlying that. But
extremely unfortunate that we've made parental alienation into a gender issue, and somewhere the child has got completely lost. The focus has been completely lost. I kind of, even to the fathers whom I work sometimes with, I tell them, do not call it father's rights. It's not a father's issue.
right.
It is equally an issue. It's an issue of the child who's the future, but we've just lost the focus completely. We've just completely. Sure, but thank you so much. And I think this was a very, very informative talk. And Dr. Harman, this is a wonderful talk. And I would really request you that at some point of time in future, we would like to have you back and, have another conversation which deep dives into a couple of such issues. But thank you so much for your time.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. All the best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.